Mustang stallion runs wild and free across a meadow in the Pryor Mountains of Montana. He carries the blood of ancient Spanish ancestors and the heritage of the American West. He runs into the wind to join a group of fellow bachelors in a mock fight, preparation for his climb up the social ladder. Notice the unusual markings on these horses, the solitary stripe down the back, and the tiger-like slashes on the legs, both signs of an ancient ancestry. These bachelor stallions are part of a small herd living on a remote federal preserve on the Montana-Wyoming border. This ruggedly beautiful area is called the Pryor Mountain Wild Horse Range and is home to the Mustangs on the mountain. North America was home to the earliest known ancestors of all modern horses. Fossil records from ancient horses have been found dating back some 60 million years. Thousands of years ago, these ancient species probably crossed a land bridge connecting to Siberia. From there, they made their way into Asia, Europe, and Africa. And that was fortunate, because for reasons scientists cannot completely explain, the precursor to today's horse died out in North America about 12,000 years ago. While North America's earliest humans probably lived without horses, people living in what is now the Ukraine domesticated horses about 6,000 years ago. The Spaniards later crossbred horses from Africa and Egypt with Northern European breeds. The fruits of European horse breeding were returned finally to the New World when Columbus landed on the Caribbean shores. Eventually, Spanish conquistadors brought horses to the North American mainland, where they were used throughout the Southwest. Later, horses were introduced to American Indian tribes. At one time, North America's most accomplished horsemen could be found among tribes like the Navajos, Apaches, Sioux, Comanches, and the Crow. Many horses escaped from the Native Americans, the Spaniards, and the European settlers. These horses formed the wild herds that roamed the western landscape, numbering in the millions by the mid-1800s. By the 1930s, only 150,000 horses remained on public lands in 11 western states. Great numbers of horses were used and destroyed in the Boer War in South Africa and in World War I. Many others were domesticated for farm and ranch labor. Wild horses were valued as a meat source for both human and pets. Beginning in 1934, the federal government authorized the removal of horses from the public range, and over 100,000 were removed by federal agencies and Mustangers over the next 20 years. Congress began to stop the extermination of wild horses in 1959, and eventually passed the Free Roaming Wild Horse and Burro Act in 1971. Under the act, the Department of the Interior's Bureau of Land Management began to manage wild horses living on the public lands. The Reverend Floyd Schwieger has lived in Lovell, Wyoming for more than 30 years. When his wife died in 1968, he found solace in the Pryor Mountains. It was there he encountered the band of wild horses, and a lifelong passion to preserve them began. Reverend Schwieger was at the forefront of the effort to establish a wild horse range. He remembers how it began.
Well, I was simply driving out of town towards the Bighorn Canyon and met several ranchers coming back who had been living in this area, particularly the Tillett boys. And as I encountered them on the road, I had asked them about whether there were any wild horses in this area. And one of them, as I recall, simply pointed up to the rocks, and there stood a stallion and his harem on a hillside. And that was my first encounter with the Pryor Mountain wild horses. After having seen the horses out there at that time, and having been interested in horses, And the Bighorn Canyon National Recreation Area being established, I felt that it was only natural that these horses should be preserved. And so I spoke to the Tillett boys, and they were looking for someone to help them in preserving these animals. And so we organized a little tour to go out there, really led by Lloyd and Royce Tillett at that time. And we had invited a few other local people along and the newspaper reporter. And from then on, I don't know how the word got to the Denver Post that fast, but they immediately sent a reporter out here. He interviewed Bess Tillett, who was about 83 years at that time, and had her picture on the front page of the Sunday Denver Post. And it was a striking picture, pictures of Lloyd and Royce. And of course, immediately, attention was called to this range war, as it was called, throughout the United States. And thousands of letters poured in, literally, to the governor of the state of Wyoming and also to the Bureau of Land Management, asking them to preserve these horses.
Today, about 120 horses run in 3 separate groups throughout 46,000 acres, encompassing Bureau of Land Management, Forest Service, and National Park Service lands. The Bureau of Land Management holds primary responsibility for the herd. How unique are the horses? A study by Gus Cothran, director of the University of Kentucky's Equine Research Laboratory, found compelling evidence that the Pryor Mountain wild horses carry Spanish horse blood that dates back to horse breeding that took place 400 years ago. In a harsh landscape like the Pryor Mountains, survival is a constant concern. Each season of the year produces the extremes of weather. The adaptability and resourcefulness of the horses is tested to the limit. The social structure of the wild horse herd is crucial in the struggle to survive. Wild horses have a strong and well-defined social organization that allows them to invest most of their energy in surviving and perpetuating themselves. The herd of approximately 120 to 130 horses is divided into small family groups. Most of these groups consist of a dominant stallion, an alpha or lead mare, and a variety of subordinate mares and young stock. The stallions will fight to acquire their mares and will be quick to defend them against rival suitors. The alpha mare is responsible for decisions on where to graze and drink. Each spring, foals are born into the band. When the fillies and young stallions reach maturity, they are cast out to find mates of their own. Fillies link up with other bands, while young stallions often join bachelor bands. The bachelors wait for the chance to form their own bands. Each member of the group has a defined social rank, which is well respected by the other members, and each mimics the behavior of the more dominant members. This is a system developed over generations that results in peaceful coexistence. Wild horses may be the most adaptable animal where food is concerned. Though they prefer tender green grass shoots, when pressed they can survive on just about anything edible. They spend most of their waking hours eating. This puts them in a vulnerable position for predators, such as mountain lions. But they've developed the ability to focus on their food and watch for rivals and predators at the same time. What will it take to keep the Pryor herd in balance with its environment? Consider this. The Pryor Mountain Mustangs live in one of the harshest climates in North America. Temperatures can be brutal all year round, and water is often scarce. And even though the horses are incredibly adaptable, forage is limited. The Mustangs must also share the range with mule deer and bighorn sheep. Yet each spring, the horse herd grows as much as 20%. And that's too much for this fragile environment to support. Managers must reduce the herd size occasionally to make sure that the horses do not overrun their range. Over the years, the Bureau of Land Management has allowed people to acquire Pryor Mountain horses through its Adopt a Horse program. Many Mustangs have made a successful transition to other lifestyles. The Pryor Mountain wild horses are unique among the nation's 50,000 free-roaming horses, gallant symbols of the Old West and the Spanish explorers of so long ago.
A lot of people have always asked me why I am this interested in these horses. I suppose there are a number of reasons. Someone once said that if you have a hobby, it must be a hobby that completely consumes you. Otherwise, it isn't too good. But when I go up in the Pryor Mountains and view the horses in their natural and their wild state, it gives me a kind of a diversion and a relief that is truly valuable to an individual. I've simply gotten a lot of pleasure out of going up and viewing the horses. And I know that there are other people too. There is a freedom which these horses show and exhibit. And as a clergyman, of course, I always relate that to some of my own beliefs. The freedom that I have found in Jesus Christ as my Lord and my Savior. There is something akin to that in my beliefs.
The Pryor Mountain wild horses have roamed these lands for at least 100 years. And if we take care of their home, the fragile alkaline soils, the delicate desert plants, the red-colored hills, all of which the horses need to survive, and if land managers keep the herd at a reasonable size, all of us can continue to enjoy these spirited creatures, these Mustangs on the mountain.